The Inca Warrior Woman. Scientists found a body buried at 5,000 meters above sea level, and their first assumption, the one they published, was completely wrong. In 2020, a team of archaeologists working in the Peruvian Andes made a discovery in a location so remote, so exposed to wind and cold, that reaching it required specialized mountain gear and acclimatization periods before any fieldwork could begin. Buried beneath layers of compacted ice and stone was a naturally preserved mummy, kept intact not by any human technique, but by the brutal freezing conditions of the high Andes itself. The preservation was remarkable. Tissue, hair, and bone structure were all largely intact after more than 600 years in the mountain. Beside the body, a stone club known as a macana, a bow, and what appeared to be the remnants of a quiver, military equipment, combat gear. The kind of burial assemblage that, in decades of Andean archaeological work, researchers had associated with one type of individual. The team's lead archaeologist noted the finding in the field report with straightforward confidence. Male warrior, significant status, likely a military commander given the quality of the burial and the weapons present. That assessment was published. It was circulated. It was, for a brief period, accepted. And then someone ran the DNA, because there was one detail in the skeletal analysis that kept surfacing in internal notes. A detail that didn't fit the warrior assumption at all. The pelvic structure, the bone morphology, the proportions that forensic anthropologists use to determine biological sex. The skeleton was not male. The question that followed wasn't just about one burial. It was about every assumption researchers had ever made about the Inca military, and about who, exactly, was doing the fighting. The lab results came back from Germany and the United States within weeks of each other. Both said the same thing, and when the lead researcher read the second confirmation, she reportedly sat in silence for a full minute before responding to her team. Tooth samples and bone fragments from the mummy had been sent to two independent genomic laboratories, one in Leipzig, one in California. The process of genome sequencing on a 600-year-old specimen is painstaking work. Ancient DNA degrades over centuries. Contamination from modern handling is a constant risk. Both labs worked under strict cleanroom protocols, and both produced results with high confidence scores. The chromosomal profile was XX. The individual was biologically female. What followed in the scientific literature was immediate and significant. Not just because of the sex determination, but because of what the concurrent bone trauma analysis revealed. The skeletal injuries documented in this individual were not consistent with ritual activity. They were not post-mortem. The wounds on the shoulder blade and the upper arm showed evidence of active bone remodeling around impact sites, meaning the body had begun to heal these injuries before the person died. In forensic terms, these were perimortem and antemortem trauma patterns, injuries sustained over time during repeated physical conflict that the body had started to repair. The conclusion the researchers published: this woman had been in battle more than once, and she had survived long enough for her skeleton to show the evidence of recovery. The theory that Inca combat was exclusively male had just been challenged, not by legend, not by mythology, but by chromosomal data and bone trauma forensics examined in two countries simultaneously. Isotope analysis found she had traveled, and the distance was extraordinary. Isotopic signatures in human bone and tooth enamel record the geography of where a person lived and ate during different phases of their life. The chemistry of local water, local soil, and local food becomes embedded in the body's structure over years. When researchers analyze those signatures, they can trace movement across regions with remarkable precision. This woman had not stayed in one place. The isotopic record showed she had moved across multiple ecological zones, from lowland agricultural areas to high-altitude mountain terrain, likely covering thousands of kilometers during her lifetime. She lived during the height of the Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire, in the 15th century. At its peak, this was the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere, stretching from present-day Colombia to central Chile, administered through a system of roads, relay runners, and regional governors. The diet embedded in her bones was consistent with a warrior's nutrition: maize, llama meat, and evidence of coca leaf use, the latter being a documented Inca practice for managing altitude, suppressing hunger, and increasing endurance in demanding physical conditions. Her teeth showed wear patterns consistent with someone who used their mouth as a tool, a common finding in individuals who worked with rope, leather, or equipment requiring manual dexterity under strain. Tattoo remnants were also identified on preserved skin tissue in patterns consistent with status markings documented in other high-ranking Inca burials. This was not an ordinary life. The evidence pointed towards someone who moved, trained, and operated at the edge of what the human body can do. Researchers found that she was not buried with everyone else. And that separation, deliberate, intentional, and geographically isolated, tells us something important about how the Inca understood who she was. The Inca relationship with death was not one of endings. It was one of continuation. The dead were considered active participants in the world of the living. Ancestors were consulted, fed ceremonially, and carried in processions during festivals. The physical body, preserved, was the anchor for that ongoing relationship with the community. Standard Inca burial practice involved wrapping the body in layers of textile into a bundle known as a fardo, a seated, compressed package that kept the body in a position associated with birth and renewal. This woman was buried in a modified version of that tradition. The wrapping was present. The positioning was consistent with high-status Inca burial practice. But the location, remote, elevated, isolated from any known community cemetery, was unusual. Alongside her body were objects consistent with an active life: practical tools, remnants of medicinal plants, and offerings associated with Inti, the Inca sun deity, whose favor was particularly significant for warriors and those who served the state in military capacities. High-altitude burials in the Andes were frequently reserved for individuals of exceptional status, placed closer to the sky, in sites that required significant effort to reach and maintain. The isolation at 5,000 meters may not have been exclusion. It may have been the highest form of recognition her society could offer. She was buried alone, but she was buried with intention. Muscle attachment sites on bone don't lie. And what the skeletal analysis revealed about how this woman's body had developed told researchers exactly what kind of life she had lived. Enthesial changes, the marks left on bone by repeated, forceful muscle use, were pronounced on her right shoulder, upper arm, and forearm. The specific pattern matched what forensic analysts describe as consistent with repetitive draw and release motion. Archery. Years of it. Beginning, based on the bone development patterns, in early adolescence. This was not incidental physical activity. This was deliberate, long-term training that started when she was young and continued throughout her adult life. Training that permanently altered the structure of her skeleton in ways that are measurable and specific. The bow found near her body was not decorative. It was a functional weapon, and her bones showed the physical consequence of using one extensively over many years. The macana, the stone club, also bore forensic analysis. The grip surface showed wear patterns consistent with frequent use, and the weapon itself was of a type typically associated with close-range combat rather than ceremonial display. Inca warriors in the high Andes did not fight in open plains. They fought in mountain terrain, narrow passes, steep ridges, rapid movement at altitude where every breath cost more than it would at sea level. Endurance and strength, maintained under those conditions, required sustained training from youth. The protective gear found near the burial, thick woven textile and animal hide construction, was practical cold-weather combat equipment, not ceremonial dress. It was made to keep someone functional and mobile in freezing mountain conditions. The evidence, taken together, described a trained combatant. Disciplined, experienced, prepared. DNA analysis found a genetic marker so rare that researchers flagged it immediately, and it raised a question that the science alone could not answer. The genomic profile of this individual contained a haplogroup variant found in fewer than 3% of ancient Andean samples analyzed to date. This was not a common bloodline. It was a lineage that, based on comparative analysis with other Inca-era remains, appeared to be associated with high-status families in the administrative center of the empire. Two theories emerged in the academic literature. The first, she may have been an Akla, a woman selected in childhood by Inca administrators for service to the state. The Akla system identified girls of exceptional ability or beauty from across the empire, brought them to training houses in Cusco, and assigned them to roles ranging from textile production to religious service to political alliance. Some scholars have proposed that elite Akla with physical aptitude may have served in protective or military capacities for the royal family. The second theory. Her genetic profile and burial quality suggested she may have been from a noble family with direct ties to the Sapa Inca's court, someone whose status derived from birth as well as service. Facial reconstruction work, based on the skull's dimensions and surviving soft tissue reference points, produced an image released in 2022. The reconstructed face showed strong cheekbone structure and features consistent with high-altitude Andean populations. She had a face. She had a lineage. She had a genetic signature distinct enough to trace across 600 years of time. But her name, the Quechua name her people called her by, the one that would have identified her rank and her origins, remains unknown. That is the one thing the science cannot give back. CT scanning found something inside the lung tissue that changed the reconstruction of her final hours entirely. When researchers ran a CT scan on the preserved thoracic cavity, the imaging revealed particulate matter embedded in the lung tissue. The analysis identified it as ash and carbon residue, the kind produced by proximity to active burning, not a cooking fire. The concentration and distribution suggested exposure to large-scale combustion, a structure burning, or a landscape on fire nearby. This placed her in a specific context before her death. Wherever she was, there had been fire. And given the combat wounds already documented on her skeleton, the interpretation in the published research was that she had been present during an engagement that involved the burning of a structure or settlement. The burial itself, however, showed no evidence of rushed handling or abandonment. The wrapping was careful. The positioning was deliberate. Offerings were placed with intention. A large flat stone was positioned over the upper body, a feature found in other high-status Inca burials that researchers associate with protective placement, not suppression. Someone had taken time with this burial. Someone had prepared it properly, with the materials and the care that her status demanded. In the aftermath of whatever conflict she had been part of, people who knew her and valued her had ensured she received the burial she was owed. The bone trauma, the ash in the lungs, the careful burial at altitude. Together, they described an ending that was neither quiet nor anonymous. She had been in the middle of something significant, and the people around her had made sure that was honored. Researchers found evidence inside the skull that rewrote what we thought we knew about medicine 600 years ago. CT imaging of the cranium revealed a section of bone that had been surgically removed and had subsequently healed. The procedure is called trepanation, the intentional removal of a section of skull, typically performed to relieve pressure caused by a traumatic head injury. It is one of the oldest surgical procedures known to archaeology, found across multiple ancient cultures on multiple continents. What made this finding significant was not the procedure itself, it was the healing. The bone showed clear evidence of new tissue growth around the surgical site, meaning the patient had survived the operation and continued living for a substantial period afterward. Successful surgery in the 15th century at altitude. Inca medical practice was, by both documentary and archaeological evidence, considerably more advanced than colonial-era Spanish accounts suggested. Records written by Spanish observers in the 16th century describe Inca surgeons performing procedures that European medicine would not attempt for another century. This skull confirmed those accounts in physical, measurable form. Beyond the trepanation, researchers collaborated with a secondary project using AI acoustic modeling. The skull's resonance cavity measurements were fed into voice frequency software to generate an approximation of the vocal range this individual likely produced. The result was openly acknowledged as speculative in the published methodology, but it produced, for the first time, something that approximated a voice, a sound from the 15th century Andes, generated from bone measurements alone. Comparative DNA analysis also linked her genome to living indigenous communities in Peru, a finding with direct implications for the ethical debate that was already beginning to build around this case. When the peer-reviewed paper was published, researchers in Norway and Switzerland were among the first international groups to request access to the full dataset. That wasn't coincidental. Both countries have long academic traditions of Andean research, and both have populations with a particular cultural attunement to mountain environments and the history of people who built civilizations in extreme terrain. The story of a woman who trained for combat at 5,000 meters resonated in places where altitude and endurance are part of the cultural identity. In the United States and United Kingdom, the story entered mainstream media through a different framing. The popular press picked it up as evidence of real historical female warriors, a counterpoint to the long-standing assumption that women in pre-Columbian societies occupied only domestic or ceremonial roles. Podcast series across multiple platforms debated the implications for how history had been written and by whom. But the most significant debate was not academic. It was legal and ethical. Indigenous communities in Peru formally requested that the remains be repatriated, returned to the land and the people connected to this woman's ancestry. The request was grounded in international frameworks protecting the rights of indigenous peoples over ancestral human remains. The scientific community was divided. The genomic data gathered from this individual had already shifted the field in measurable ways. But the argument from indigenous advocates was not about data. It was about dignity, about the right of a community to determine what happens to the remains of their ancestors, regardless of what science might still extract from them. That tension between the knowledge science extracts and the rights of the people connected to it remains unresolved. The case is ongoing. Researchers are now looking for more, and the woman found at 5,000 meters may be the first of many. Following publication of the findings, 3 separate archaeological teams in Peru, Bolivia, and northern Chile announced expanded survey operations in high-altitude sites previously dismissed as too remote or too difficult to justify excavation costs. The technology that made this discovery possible, portable genomic sampling kits, non-invasive CT imaging, and isotope analysis, has become more accessible and more precise since 2020. The scientific consensus, as of the most recent published literature, is that the Inca Empire's military structure was more complex and more inclusive than the colonial-era Spanish records suggested. Those records were written by men, about men, for a European audience that had its own assumptions about gender and warfare. What they described was a filtered version of reality. The bones told a different story. This woman, unnamed, unrecorded in any written source, buried alone on a mountain at the edge of the sky, survived combat, underwent surgery, traveled thousands of kilometers, and was given a burial that her community reserved for people of significance. She did not leave a document. She did not leave a name. What she left was a body that, 600 years later, science could read like a biography. The question researchers keep returning to is not whether female warriors existed in the Inca Empire. That question has been answered. The question now is how many others are still up there, preserved in ice, waiting at altitude, carrying evidence of lives that the written record erased, but the mountains kept. If you could go back and ask her one question, what would it be?